Welcome back to Tranquility du Jour, nourishing conversations about living a full and meaningful life with doses of tranquility. This is episode 554. I'm your host, Kimberly Wilson, bringing you tranquility through this medium since 2005. Today, we're talking with the lovely Scout Sobel and all about her brand new book, which is so good. I'm like, I wish I'd had this when I started out. And it's called The Emotional Entrepreneur. You'll find a link, of course, to this in the show notes at kimberlywilson.com/554. You're going to learn about emotional independence, how to create the environment you want, why uncertainty is the only guarantee, ways to celebrate the small wins, and more. And before we dive in, a reminder to hit the subscribe button in your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon, etc. And there's a link to all these in the show notes. Also, visit kimberlywilson.com/podcast for more information on the show. And if you're new to Tranquility du Jour, a big welcome, and you can learn more in the show notes, or just go to kimberlywilson.com/new. Also, save the date. We have a few things around the corner. First off is the TDJ Live Masterclass seasonal offering I've been doing for 15 plus years. And this will happen on Sunday, September 19th. From 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And of course, this is a free event. Would love to have you join. And also, the final virtual retreat of the year is happening on October 2nd. And that is all about some movement, some creative work, some reflection, and really kind of looking ahead. There are only a few months left in this year, at least at that point. And what do we want to see for ourselves? And finally, there's two other items to join the waitlist for. Again, links to these in the show notes. The 5-week TDJ Lifestyle e-course, where we go through each of the tenets: creativity, compassion, wellness, style, and mindfulness. We'd love to have you join for that, and that will only be offered once this year. And then, of course, the TDJ Passholder Collective, which gives you access to everything happening all year, and that will be for 2022. There's a wait list for that, and I will begin offering that later in the year. So if you'd like to be the first to know, you can sign up for these again in the show notes. All right, now without further ado, Scout. She is the founder of Scout's Agency, co-host of the popular OK Sis podcast, and the host of Scout podcast. She's a trailblazer in the media industry for utilizing podcasts as a powerful form of PR. After starting OK Sis, which focuses on female guests, she fell in love with spreading women's stories and identified the rising popularity and influence of podcasting. She started Scout's Agency with an emphasis in podcast PR for women entrepreneurs, podcasters, and brands. She's lived with bipolar disorder for the last 15 years. She was once unable to function in society, but after finding entrepreneurship and taking radical responsibility over her emotions, she is now able to live a life of purpose. Her debut book, The Emotional Entrepreneur, provides the mindset and emotional tools she learned from managing her mental health that have helped her succeed in business. I think you're going to be so inspired from this podcast. And again, I was like, I wish I'd had this book. It's so good. Welcome, Scout. Such a treat to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am honored. I'm excited. I know we've done some work together in the past, so to see your face is such a treat.
Yeah, and you have so many amazing people. And so that's what I want to start with is tell us about your journey to creating Scout's Agency.
Yeah, so I am the founder of Scout's Agency. I started it almost 2.5 years ago now, and it really stemmed out of, I started a podcast with my sister called OK Sis Podcast. And 6 months in, a little less than 6 months in, our community at that time was obviously smaller than it is today. We've been podcasting for almost 3 years, but I recognized that when we would have a guest on, let's say she had an activewear line, they would follow her on Instagram, buy her product, etc. And I recognized the power of being a guest on a podcast. But then when my sister and I started being guests on podcasts, we got to see it firsthand. Our downloads would go up, our Instagram followers would increase, we would get new community members. And I remember thinking, wow, there's something really here. Being a guest on a podcast, I predicted would be the new form of PR. And it wasn't just the ROI that really intrigued me, which was clear and obvious. It really was also the fact that it was long form, intimate. You got to really see somebody's personality. And through that, I fell in love with the medium so significantly. And I was working for my mom at the time. I have a long, I have a long journey with suffering from a mental illness. And so I found entrepreneurship very young. And it was this huge catalyst for me. But after going through a few iterations, some failures, I was like, I need some money. So I started working for my mom, but the goal was to get back to that place where I was running my own thing. And so with this kind of newfound love for podcasting, I was like, you know what, let me see if I can get people as guests on podcasts. And so I created an Excel spreadsheet of over 1,000 podcasters because since I was a host, I thought that they would more easily trust me and I could niche down into that industry. And I had a media kit set up and I emailed so many people that first day that Gmail blocked my email because they thought I was spam. So I was like, well, fuck this. I'm going to keep going. I opened a second email up and then I had 2 emails for a while, which was a disaster. And 4 months later, quit my day job. 6 months later, had a roster of 10. And then very quickly identified that my services, which were booking guests on people's podcasts, high profile guests like Colby Calais, Sophia Moroso, Ali Webb. And then our second service was the podcast tour, which is our bread and butter, which is really getting women as guests on podcasts, which is what we do for book tours to promote their business, etc. And then traditional PR could really be applied to women in all industries, whether they had a podcast or not. So we opened the gates to representing just women in business, women speaking their truth, women getting their coaching services out there, becoming authors, etc. And so, 2.5 years later, we represented women like Rebecca Minkoff, Kat Sadler, Jessica Zweig, Vanessa Rossetto, and have become the leading agency in specifically podcast tours. So it has been a wild ride, one that totally did not start with a business plan, any foresight, any type of planning. It was me, a coffee shop, a blocked Gmail account, and an Excel spreadsheet. But my sister always says, I jump and I pray a parachute appears. And I think it's taken me this long to realize that I am the parachute every single time. So that's how I started.
I love it. I love it. Because, I've been hearing from you guys for quite a while and booked quite a few of you, your clients on the show. And yet I didn't really know the background of the story of Scout's agency. So I love this.
Yeah, it's been cool. I really wanted to focus in on female voices. I wanted to provide opportunities for women to tell their stories. As someone in the entrepreneurial space, I understood the power of getting in front of new audiences and growing your business that way. And so for us, that's specifically through podcast or traditional PR. But the main kind of, I suppose, ethos or mission of the business is to support women and getting their name out there.
I love it. I love it. Well, and so you mentioned just briefly, kind of in your intro, a little bit about mental health. And so I would love to hear, and of course, I'm going to ask tons about your book, The Emotional Entrepreneur, which I'm very excited about, all these lessons, 25 that you came up with. But tell us a little bit about kind of your mental health journey and even how that plays into your work.
Yeah. So I had my first depressive episode at the age of 14. And I went down real fast. I was self-harming. I was restricting food. I was wearing sweats and not the kind of trendy athleisure wear you see today. It was a mess. And that really started me on my path to recognizing that I needed more support in the emotional arena. So I was in therapy from a very young age, but it wasn't really until I went for college that I started recognizing that my mind had patterns that were really destructive and dangerous. I entered into states of paranoia and psychosis where I thought Men were following me home. They were underneath my bed. They were in my closet. And I started to really lose touch with reality. And in that losing touch with reality, I think it took that for my parents and me to say, oh, I'm not just a teenager who's having difficulties managing her mood. There's a bigger story being told here that gets to be addressed. And, at 20, I was formally diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And the minute I got my diagnosis, I was on a flight home and dropped out of college. I was in those years in my early 20s, unable to hold a job. And I'm not talking about, a corporate job. I'm talking about being a gelato scooper, talking about being a hostess. My friends were graduating from top universities and I was quitting Sammy's, 4 weeks into working as a hostess. And there was a lot of talk about me being unable to function in society as a member. And it was hard. I quit everything I ever started. I was in extreme depression. I went through outpatient. I went through inpatient where they actually locked me up under 5150, which I briefly talk about in my book. And as I started garnering some strength up, which really started when I started dating my husband, then boyfriend, and he comes from the recovery background. He is 10 years sober. He looked at me in the early ages of dating and he said, I don't care if you're depressed. If you're depressed and hopeful, I can stick around. If you're depressed and hopeless, I will not be in this relationship. And it woke me up to the simplicity of healing, which is I just added in hope. That's all I did. And adding in that hope led me to support groups, led me to self-help books, led me to gratitude, led me to prayer. Hope turned into faith. And I started down my healing journey. Now, this was 8-9 years ago, which to some might not seem that long ago, but in reality, Instagram was just starting, the hashtag self-care, mental health, all that was not around. And I thought that my diagnosis was a death sentence. I thought that I would be chalked up to being crazy for the rest of my life because there was no mainstream narrative that I could look to at that time. And so, my healing journey and the phases of it is, a 2-hour conversation, and it has been, ups and downs for sure. But what has been an anchor in my healing process has been entrepreneurship. The minute I found entrepreneurship, which I was sitting at a coffee shop, it was about a year after my husband said that to me. So I was in support groups, starting to, I think at that point I was holding a job as a barista for 2 months. And I brought home a magazine from a trip to New York, and I was sitting at a coffee shop and I showed my friend the magazine and I said, and I don't know where this came from. I truly believe I just tapped back into that moment, and it was such a divine, it was so planted into me as this incredible moment of inspiration. I said, do you want to start a magazine? And she said, yeah. And we said, okay, well, we'll just print it at Kinko's and all the photos will be taken from disposable cameras and we'll pass it out for free. And something in my mind turned on that I have yet to be able to turn off. And I went home and I got the domain. I got the Instagram account label. I researched printers. I set up appointments at the best printers in town. Suddenly I had a quote of 10 grand. I did a Kickstarter for 10,000, got that. I made the first magazine, passed it out for free, got a distribution contract, and it was sold at every newsstands for issue 2. Halsey was on the cover for issue 3, and Barnes & Noble contacted us. And they brought it on and sold it across every single location. And it was the thing that changed my life. Entrepreneurship for me, especially with my experience living with a mental illness, entrepreneurship is ups and downs. It's highs and lows. And while there is every book out there in the market about how to manage a P&L and how to hire and how to scale and how to build that revenue, I recognize entrepreneurship as just an emotional game. That's all it was. And so while I was healing my bipolar, I recognized that those exact tools that I was using to manage the highs and lows of my bipolar were the same tools that I could use to manage my entrepreneurial pursuits that would actually make me successful. And so the marriage of the two was so clear in my mind, and you don't have to have a mental illness to want and need to conquer the emotional aspects of entrepreneurship. But that's how the two of them have intersected so beautifully. And I'm so grateful for entrepreneurship because it allows my bipolar to dance and breathe and grow and strengthen and be challenged in a way where I get to take full responsibility over my emotions and my career at the same time, which I think is very healing. And almost, and I say this word in not a negative way, that pressure allows me to show up successfully.
It's huge. It's huge, the blending of the two, right? Versus like compartmentalizing or isolating. And so, I'm curious if you could say there's one thing, and I know that is like ridiculous and not possible, but let's go with it. Like, what would you say is the one thing that's made the biggest difference to you from a mental health perspective / entrepreneur perspective?
Mm-hmm. The one thing, it's easy for me to identify, and it's actually the thing that I came across last year, which is very late in my healing journey, is that I am safe in my emotions. No matter what emotion hits me, I have the ability to remind myself and ground myself that I am safe. So this is applicable to when anxiety hits or a depressive episode hits, or I feel like there's a guy in my house or someone my psychosis starts flaring up. It's applicable to when I get an email from a client who isn't happy. I am safe in my emotions. You are safe in your emotions, and they are fleeting. They come and they go, and our ability to effectively move through challenges in our life is for us in moments of extreme discomfort, extreme emotional discomfort, is to remind ourselves that we are safe and that this is happening for us and not to us. And so that mindset, that belief, it's not even a mindset at this point. It was a reversing of a core belief, which was I am not safe in my emotions, and creating that core belief that I am safe in my emotions. That will help you put out every entrepreneurial fire, as well as every personal emotional hurdle that you go through.
I love that, because that's one of the things that I highlighted in particular from your book is emotional independence is where it's at. And I wrote kind of like these few bullets that you had mentioned. You mentioned more, and I just pulled a few out. As you mentioned, giving thanks to your emotions, reminding yourself it will pass, exactly what you were just saying, and then moving energy, which I kind of wanted to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
But this piece on reminding yourself it will pass and giving them kind of room to breathe, them meaning your emotions. I love it because it makes me think of a Pema Chodron quote. And I don't know if you know who she is, but she's a Buddhist writer. And, she says, you're the sky, everything else is just the weather. And I love that, right? This reminder of like these emotions, they're going to come through, but it doesn't mean they're going to be there forever. And then we have to grasp onto them. So I love that. I think it's a great reminder.
Yeah. And even taking it one step further, because people would tell me that all the time when I was in the depths of my depression. My mom would say, this passes, this passes, this passes. And I would say, but it will come back. Mm-hmm. And so I was afraid of the coming back. So then the second step is, once you feel safe in your emotions and once you can accept that it's going to pass, is to also accept life unconditionally, and to know that every time you get out of an uncomfortable emotion, that doesn't mean that it's not going to come back at one point in your life, and to not be afraid of the coming back, but to just accept the spectrum, the patchwork, the blueprint that is the emotional experience, and to fall in love with the emotional experience by accepting it unconditionally allows you to not only feel safe in your emotions, but also to not be afraid when, quite frankly, shit hits the fan again.
Absolutely. No, that's a good reminder. It's like, okay, yeah, we'll get through this, right? We'll get through this emotion. But yeah, it's going to return. I mean, it's not like, oh, after this, then everything is like sunshine and bunnies, right? It's like, it might be for a little bit, but then, we're going to get that email, or we're going to have a traffic delay, or whatever can just send us into a tizzy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And so for me, it was the fear of the emotion, and then the fear of the future emotion that I had to really work on.
So let's talk about, because I love your lesson number 1. And I really thought this was good, all these lessons, because I thought, I wish I had had this book before I started my business that I ran for 18 years. It's like, particularly that you get to create whatever environment you want, but I'll circle back to that. So let's start with number 1. It's personal and emotional. Tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, I think that we were fed a long time or growing up that business was this thing where emotions don't exist, that it's not personal, it's just business. It's cutthroat, it's dry, it's masculine, it's male oriented. And, yes, I make the distinction of if someone doesn't buy your product or engage in your services, it is not a personal reflection of you and your worth as a human being on this planet or your worth as a CEO. It is, however, the entire process of creating a business. It is a highly personal endeavor and it is highly emotional. I think that the narrative that it's cut and dry, that it's cutthroat, that it's just business allows one was, I suppose, a narrative that is outdated and really belongs to a different paradigm. But two, I think it is part of the reason why they say that most businesses fail in 5 years is because nobody prepared us for the highly emotional experience that starting a business would take on our state. And so when you create a business, it's your life. It's not only what financially on a survival basis funds your life, it's hopefully, which is why you got into it, what fuels your soul, your creativity, your purpose, your interests. It's what gets you up in the morning. It's what creates vibrancy in your life. It's what creates meaning. And so I am saying, yes, the revenue exists, and that cutthroat moment where we're having a team meeting and it's like you got to pull it together and it's not time to be emotional in that moment. Those things are all true. But when you go to bed at night and when you are thinking and dreaming of your business and all that it brings you, it's a highly personal thing. It's how do you work? Do you work better taking calls at 9 or do you work better taking calls at 1 in the afternoon? Do you work better in an office or do you work better at home? What are the things that light you up every day? How can we do more of those? So for me, business is this incredible self-development, self-inquiry about what's going to light your soul up the most. So in that way, yes, I know that tomorrow if Scout's agency were to disappear, I would be devastated, but I would be okay. At the same time, it's my life. And you can't say that anything in your life isn't personal and emotional.
Right, right. Yeah. It's so hard, right, to pull yourself out of the equation and to think like, oh, well, it's business, it's not personal, right? I mean, and yet it's also hard to, make sure you're not taking things too personal, but you're keeping in mind your personal preferences and needs, etc. So it's a tricky dance.
Yeah. And I always say, don't take things personally when you're engaging with other people and the way they react or treat you. That's not the point of that phrase. Think of it as what you are creating is highly personal because you get to personalize it to meet your soul's needs.
I love that. I love that. And I think that ties in too with this lesson. You get to create whatever environment you want. And the one piece that kind of stuck out for me with that was like what's your team saying about their job when you're not around, right? And or like what are people like recipients of your services, are they like, oh my gosh, I love that webinar, or oh, that was such a waste of time, or it's like that's a really important thing. And as you think about personalizing, it's like, how do you want to personalize the way in which you're presenting all of this to the world, your team, etc.?
Yeah, I'm first, let's talk about the team side of things. As the owner of the business, I think one of the pros is that I'm the leader of the ship so that I get to alter things to my liking. So for example, I don't like working in an office. We were in an office, COVID hit, we, didn't re-sign the lease, and it worked so much more for my productivity levels, for my energy levels, for everything for me to work at home. So Scout's agency is now, until further notice, a remote business. And so you need to find people who also jive with that situation, right? But when it comes to my team, something that is so important to me because I live with a mental illness and because I probably would internally combust working for anybody else, is that it's a need, which is maybe healthy or not, or I should say, it is one of my missions to make sure that my team's job adds to their mental health and their baseline of purpose. it does not have to be responsible for all of their happiness, purpose, everything. That's too much of a, burden to put on me. However, I want Scouts Agency to light up my employees. I want them to be fulfilled by their job. I want them to be stoked. And I check in with them constantly. They shared with me they haven't had Sunday scaries since working for me. They shared with me that they pinch themselves that they work here and it's the best job they've ever had. And so the mental health of my employees is very, very important to me. And in that, I do things differently. I don't care if you couldn't sleep last night and so you want to take a 3-hour nap in the middle of the day and you have no meetings. Take the nap. I'd much rather you work when you're biologically on and inspired and clear-headed. If you're constantly working with brain fog and tired and going against your biology, over time, you're going to resent your job. So my team always tells me I'm going for acupuncture. It's 11 a.m. Okay, have a good acupuncture. They tell me my friend's in town. I'm going to lunch. They tell me I'm taking a nap. There's just this flexibility because I want them to feel freedom over their own lives. And I want them to do what's best for their bodies, their mind, and their souls so that when they are working, it's productive, it's great, it's energized, it's focused. So there's, we can go real deep into that, but creating that environment is not congruent with the corporate 9-to-5 strict PTO. I don't know. My employee that I just hired, she was like, how many sick days do I get and how many vacations day do I get? And I was like, listen, I don't fucking know. Okay. If your friends are going to Mammoth last minute and we don't have something big on Friday, like you should probably go to Mammoth. It's like, it's just this balance. And look, that brings opportunities for people to take advantage of you. I completely understand that. So it's about finding the environment that you really want, not only for yourself, but for your team. And then the people who match that will be attracted to you.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I'm curious, what have you done whenever you found that, they're going for acupuncture like every day? Not that anyone would probably do that, but
no, totally. I haven't run into that. I've run into very small things and it's a very quick, like, hey, if you're going to go to yoga, can you please just make sure that if we have a meeting at 10, you're actually at your computer at 10, not Zooming on the car ride home. So it's just placing the boundaries around that. We have really the only thing is if there's a meeting in the calendar, you're at your computer, at your office, at home, whatever. And then, I've never really had a case where we've had to seriously have a conversation like that. And I think as the leader of the ship is something that I'm learning, it's when something little like that happens to address it in the moment, because it's so much it's easier to digest, oh, okay, I have freedom, but I have to be at my computer when we have a meeting, than 3 months down the line, you're like internally combusting about all the things your employee didn't do, which is something I'm learning. But to be honest, we have not had a case where that has been abused.
That's great. That's great. Cause I've had friends who get jobs at places where it's like, there's no like time limit on PTO and all that. And they're like, but the pressure is, and these are larger organizations, where it's like, well, the pressure is to not take it versus whenever you have a set amount of time. And I'm not hearing that with yours, but I thought that was really interesting. I'm like, if you're not given a designated amount of time, people are like, hesitant to take it. So it's so interesting, how people try to set up these really great ideas. Like I think of Zappos and, it was like, there's no hierarchy, there's no direct reports. And, I read that 1 out of 7 people left after that. Right. It's like, you need a little bit of structure. And it sounds like you have that. Like you need to be, if we have a meeting, like you need to be at your computer, not Zooming from the car. Mm-hmm. So I love that.
Yeah. And I think my only thing with because that does make me nervous, that whole like you can have as much paid time off as possible. I think really the only parameter is that it's approved if it's longer than a few days and it's no longer than 2 weeks at a time. Like anything over 2 weeks, I'm like, okay, I need to bring somebody in to do your job at that point. But it's this wonderful dance where we all figure out that we want to be here first of all. So in wanting to be here, we take our job seriously, and the freedom also is available.
I love that. And I do think, I hope that, post-COVID, there's going to be a bit more of this, the freedom and the flexibility of working from home and things along those lines. And, it's like, if you want to go work in Maui, if you want to go spend 2 weeks there and still work, like, fine, even if you want to like not work, but, take 2 weeks in Maui. But, it's just like this ability to have that freedom. My hope is like that your idea of creating this like environment will also trickle into corporate a bit.
Yeah. hopefully.
Well, and one other thing, well, a couple others that are really kind of big COVID related pieces is like, I love this, is uncertainty is your only guarantee.
Hmm.
And pivot, but don't give up. I feel
Hmm.
like pivot was a big kind of encouragement with regard to life in the pandemic. And then also, uncertainty is the only guarantee. I mean, people struggle with this. We like control. And for many brains, I've learned uncertainty equals danger. Right. So tell us a little bit about uncertainty is the only guarantee and pivot, but don't give up.
Uncertainty is probably the reason most of our emotional discomfort and problems root from, I would say. For me, once I realized, and look, to be an entrepreneur, you have to live with a high level of uncertainty. And there's also a dance with that too, right? You can't live in fear the whole time. You can't feel as if your foundation is about to fall every second. You can't feel as if half your client roster is going to go, because then you're going into all of your work with a fear-based mindset versus a secure and abundant mindset. However, there's this idea that set me free that none of it's guaranteed. The corporate job, the tenure as a professor, the marriage, when your parents are going to pass, like literally none of this is guaranteed. None of this is for sure. There is nothing certain about anything, period. And so if you can adopt that and not view it as scary, but view it as expansive, well, if nothing is certain and the things that I'm doing are to put facades of certainty around me so that I feel safe, am I able to choose which facade I put up? And if I'm able to choose which facade I put up, can I make it the one that fuels me and fulfills me? And so once I notice that nothing is guaranteed, working at the job where I get the paycheck every single month, that's not guaranteed, but I trick my mind into thinking it is. It opened up a whole door of, well, let's just create what we want. Let's just do what we want. And yes, this is a hard one. And I think this is what identifies the entrepreneur from someone who's not an entrepreneur, which, by the way, let me say that entrepreneurship, which I'm totally obviously capitalizing on. I have a book called The Emotional Entrepreneur. The word entrepreneur is a buzzword, very, very trendy thing to say. Everybody wants to be their own boss, blah, 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 blah. It is not the only way to live a fulfilling life. And for many, it is not the way to live a fulfilling life. And so this is not me saying, hey, tear down that facade that your job is secure and become an entrepreneur and tackle uncertainty. That's not it at all. If you are more prone to an entrepreneurial lifestyle, the ones who can deal with the uncertainty are the ones that will succeed. The ones who can deal with taking the pay cut check 1 month because things went wrong and not totally internally combust and fall apart are the ones that are going to succeed. The ones that can take the risk and handle the uncertainty of the risk. And so handling uncertainty, because it lives underneath everything, and falling in love with it and developing a healthy relationship with it and seeing it as expansive versus restricting, in my opinion, is one of the biggest mindset tools that can move you through things when things feel uncertain.
What about pivoting?
Pivoting, sorry, yes.
No, it's okay. I
Yeah,
threw
I
a lot
forgot.
at you.
I was like, I think she asked something else. Pivoting is also a fine dance, right? In many ways, what we saw last year, which I was fortunate enough to not necessarily have to pivot so significantly, even though I did pivot, is that a lot of people had to pivot their entire business model. And the ones who jumped on the course, the ones who are malleable, the ones who will change quickly, which I've done in micro levels for different things. My sister and I had a live event. It wasn't selling. How do we pivot our messaging? How are we not showing up, moving it around? We sold, we doubled our tickets within a few days because we just sat and said, this isn't working. And how do we pivot to make it work? So pivoting is not some big, necessarily, unless you're talking about COVID and other things. I want people to get into the mind frame of it doesn't mean you have a brick and mortar and then you pivot to e-commerce and now, you're selling your book on Kindle versus paper, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that, even though, yes, it did for many last year, which those who did, I hope are doing well. Pivoting is not being so attached to the way you want to do it. It's the ability to listen to the market. It's the ability to listen to what people want. It's the ability to tap into the zeitgeist. It's the ability to tap into the cultural wants and needs, and to know that maybe selling it this way isn't the way it's going to work, but selling it this way is. It's not being so precious about your systems and ideas while maintaining your integrity and your dream and your vision and making sure you can stand behind it. So there's so many times in entrepreneurship where you think this is the way forward and you have to pivot real fast to make a deadline or a launch or a revenue goal or what it might be. And so instead of me necessarily saying pivot from brick and mortar to e-commerce and now you got a whole new business model, it's more in the daily fine tuning of the way your business works. You have to be malleable. You have to change with the people around you. Your business is not just you. It's an energetic exchange between your customers, your clients, and everything. And we get to dance with them. So it's the ability to have someone else, meaning the market, your customer, your client, take the lead at times, and you being able to be malleable in that.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think it's just such a great reminder of how do we look at, okay, like what's the current environment and what changes can we make? And
versus giving up.
Exactly.
Because when something's not working, like, believe me, you are sitting there stressed the fuck out. You're probably crying. You don't know what to do. You're in chaos. Everything's crumbling. And it's a very easy time to say, I'm tapping out. It's in that time, if you hold on for just a few seconds more and open your mind to a new possibility, that a different way to do things will come in and you will be able to pivot successfully.
Don't you find, like, because I love this idea of like pivot, don't give up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like keep going. But then I also love the idea of like, know when it's time to let go. And it's such a fine dance that's so unique to everyone. Have you figured that one out?
Yeah. I mean, look, I've closed the door on many projects that haven't worked. However, I don't necessarily believe I gave up, because I had a podcast before OK Sis podcast. I closed that down to start OK Sis. That one wasn't working. It was time to shut it down. OK Sis came through. You know, there's been so many times where I started a blog, which turned into the podcast, which turned into OK Sis, which turned into Scout's agency. So I have been pivoting and running with energy all along. It's changing the narrative that because you close down a project or that you close down a business that you gave up. It's the willing to take that close down or that ending of that chapter and catapult it into your next. That's the pivot. The pivot doesn't have to be under the same LLC name. It doesn't have to be under the same medium, the name, none of it. It's taking something that's not working and rolling with what does into the next.
I love that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's what it means for me. People have looked, you can look at my resume and say, wow, she's failed at a fuck ton of things. I look at it and say, oh my God, that led to that, which led to that, which prepped me for that, and it's all connected for me.
Yeah, it's like metamorphosis. I love it. I think that's a great a great way to look at it, right? Because it's, yeah. I mean, it's not like you closed down a podcast and went to, I don't know, like what's something completely random, like making gelato, right? Like, you know, it's like you every step kind of led to the next, and it influenced.
Like if you sing and someone tells you you're a bad singer and you get publicly humiliated, do you shut your voice down? Or do you figure out other ways to use it?
Right. I love that. Great. You have so many good lessons. I highlighted many of them, but I think that people are going to really, really vibe with this book. I'm curious. I just have a couple more questions for you, Scout, and just thinking, like, what is your typical day like?
My typical day, it's very, I wake up, I have like 2 hours in the morning to myself, which, preface, I'm not a mom. I know that'll change one day, but I have a lot of alone time in the morning. I don't look at my phone in the morning. I go for a walk. I journal. I like to center my days. But as far as work goes, I have sleepy seasons and I have active seasons. So end of 2020 was a lot slower. I worked less. I had less on my calendar. This year with the book launch, we launched a course for Scout's agency on how to get yourself as a guest on podcasts, a self-led course that teaches our program that we do for our one-on-one clients, as well as scaling the team, etc. my days have been a little bit more packed. So really an average day is me at my computer from like 8 to 6-ish. I can have anywhere from 3 to 8 calls a day, podcast interviews, podcast recordings for my podcast. I run Scout Podcast, which is my solo podcast where I talk about the intersection of mental health and entrepreneurship. So it's really emails, just desk work, calls with my team, calls with prospective clients, calls with clients, networking calls, or podcasting. So it's a lot of, it's not that dynamic. I don't think it's not that interesting, I guess, but I love it.
Yeah, no, it is interesting. And I love too that you take those 2 hours in the morning for yourself. I think that's critical.
Yes, 100%. It sets my day up so well.
So my last question for you is, the name of this podcast is Tranquility du Jour. So I'm curious, how do you find tranquility in your everyday with all your balls in the air?
So there's 2 things that I really go to when I need. So there's one thing I do preventively to incorporate tranquility into my life every day, which is the mentioned 2 hours in the morning where I'm really just to myself. Journaling is a huge way I tap into that, to just kind of, I suppose journaling is more self-processing. Anxiety can come up. So for tranquility specifically, I pick cards. I love picking cards. They just calm me down. They don't put me in the wheel. They allow something else to ride the moment. And then if I really need to just settle the nervous system down, I'll go outside into my backyard. I will take my shoes off and I will walk on the grass barefoot with no phone and just look around at the sky, at trees. I find that that's the best way to really ground myself into tranquility.
Yeah, you probably know of walking meditation, right? It's like...
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it sounds very much like that. It's a lovely way to slow and connect. And there's a beautiful quote by Thich Nhat Hanh I'm paraphrasing it, but it's basically like, walk as if your feet are kissing the earth. Isn't that beautiful?
That's so beautiful. Oh, I'm going to think of that next time I ground.
Yeah. It's just so different than our typical kind of getting from A to B,
100%.
Well, thank you so much for being here, and congratulations on this amazing new book. And I can't wait to see what's next for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And you guys can follow me at Scout Sobel on Instagram for more emotional entrepreneur stuff.
Over in the show notes, you will find ways to find our beloved guest, Miss Scout. There's a link to her book, Instagram, and website. Finally, if you are not yet part of the TDJ Insiders Facebook group, be sure to click the link in the show notes and head on over and join us. We're reading Burnout this month, and you'll also find doses of inspiration kind of sprinkled throughout the month there, and ways to connect with others. If you're not yet signed up for my weekly inbox love notes, you can do that again in the show notes, or go to KimberlyWilson.com/love notes. You'll get invites, inspiration, and more. They're on hiatus through September, or into September. And also browse my 6 books and planner. Ways to find Tranquility du Jour on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Also a link to my locally sewn, eco-friendly, seasonless clothing line, TDJ. And then finally, if you have a moment to share a review of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, would be so grateful. And also there's a link to Amazon and Goodreads if you would like to share a review of any of my books, would be so grateful. And if you do any of those, please do a screenshot, send it to me, and I'll send you a little snail mail love note. All right, thank you so much, as always, for tuning in. I wish you a delicious, delightful week ahead. Namaste.